The first time that Congressman Lewis became aware of segregation, he traveled to Buffalo when he was 11 years old from Troy, and he saw that northern cities were not segregated on buses, not in schools, not in institutions. So he became acutely aware of segregation at that point in his life. And when he came back, he heard Dr. King on the radio in 1955 when he was just a young person, and it began to trigger thoughts about trying to make a difference. And he met Rosa Parks when he was 17, and the first time that he met Dr. King was as a teenager a year later when he was 18. So travel has always been a part of his life, and it's always represented an understanding of the world beyond where he lived. He traveled all over the country, traveled weekly between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, and travel was as much a part of his life as his DNA. It just opened doors for him. It opened a consciousness of race in the United States and an understanding of how things need to be better, how they could be better, by seeing different geographic regions in the United States. And it began as a young boy when he was 11 and making that trip from Troy to Buffalo, New York.
And Jeff, one of the social media stories that I saw that really stuck out, one of my sorority sisters is a flight attendant with Delta. And she talked about the impact that he had. They were on the same travel schedule, with her being based in Atlanta, him having to fly to Atlanta, that DC to Atlanta commute. And it doesn't matter how many years they overlapped, he always would say, "Hey, you headed home? We're headed home." And it was just those little small encounters that you had, especially with his routine and the people that he saw along his routine and fighting for justice all across the country. So from the story we shared yesterday with the barber who has this awesome photo with his 4-year-old son now with the congressman, to the flight attendants that he encountered on that DC to Atlanta commute, and then just to see Mr. Griggs here, this guy say, "You traveled so much, you did so much for us. During a pandemic, I am going to go from Troy, Alabama to Washington, D.C., now back to Atlanta." Such a great find from Naima on the ground there, finding this gentleman. And it just really, really grabs at your heart when you think about yourself to say, how many impactful relationships do I have? How do I impact just everyday people on my trip to the grocery store, in our community? Am I reachable? Am I touchable? Am I impactful? And I think we're learning so much about all of those different areas of his life where, despite who he was, people would just cry seeing him and wanting to take pictures. Jeff, you said he was always so humble and was gonna take the photos and was gonna give people, this great experience. And I think what we're seeing from these celebrations is that it wasn't talking the talk. It was a man who truly walked the walk in that regard.
Well, he was reelected 16 times in the 5th Congressional District, which historically has been a very liberal district, perhaps the most in the state of Georgia. And, he garnered over 70% of the vote most of the time. I had one guy come up to me who was running against him a number of years ago, who I can't remember his name at this point, but he got on me and said, "You guys in the media, you don't give anybody a fair shot," on and on and on, complaining about coverage as he was running against John Lewis. And I said, with all due respect to you, I said, you're going to get between 13 and 15% of the vote, no matter what you do. I mean, it is a mountain of which you cannot climb, but go for it.
Go for it.
But there is no one that is constricting your ability to best John Lewis in the 5th Congressional District. If you think that those of us that are reporters somehow or other are an obstacle toward you having a fair shot, I said, truth be told, John Lewis doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you're running. You're just not going to do very well, and this is what you're going to do. And that was the case every time since 1987. And being in Congress is a very tough job because you're constantly running for re-election. You never stop. You're always running, and it means that you can't really be anywhere very long, whether it's Washington, D.C., or here in Atlanta. You're constantly running for office. You're trying to touch your constituents, yet at the same time you're trying to make an impact in D.C. It is a job that is not for everybody, but John Lewis, no matter your politics, made it work for himself. I mean, it's amazing. he was constantly in the air, constantly traveling in his district, and he was seen in his district. It wasn't like, some people in Congress go to Washington, D.C., and they sort of lose their connection oftentimes with their district. They become creatures of Washington, D.C. But John Lewis was never that way, man. He was everywhere in the 5th District, and we've talked about this before, Aisha. I've seen him over the years in the Kroger at Ansley shopping at various times, and he was the Pied Piper of Hamelin. People would follow him from aisle to aisle, wanting his time, wanting a handshake, wanting a picture, and he was always patient. He was never in a hurry. It must have been madness for him to go shopping because everybody wanted a picture, and we've seen that since his death. If you look at Facebook, you look at Twitter, you look at Instagram, it seems like everybody had
Everyone
a picture.
has a picture,
Yeah,
right?
everybody has a picture with John Lewis.
The memories are endless. And I really do think it's a good example for people who may be considering a career in politics. How do you do this? How do you really still stay connected to the people that you're serving?
I don't know how you do it, but John Lewis is one of the few people in Congress who really figured it out. You know, when you look at Congress today, some really talented people, both Republicans and Democrats, opt not to stay. I mean, I'm thinking about Tom Graves in Northwest Georgia, who is a relatively young man who successful, loved in his district, and he has opted not to run for re-election. And I think that's the case in a lot of places around the country. They feel like they're not making a difference in the House, that they're part of a collective group. And John Lewis certainly was part of the collective group, but again, never losing touch with his constituents. And I thought he had an interesting soundbite that we have been running the past couple of days about the number of people who come to Washington, D.C. in elected roles who say how much they hate government and they lament government and they loathe it. And his point was, well, if you hate government, why are you a part of it? Wanting to make a difference, and government can do that. It can change people's lives in the right hands. And certainly in the 5th Congressional District, as you take a look at those 16 re-election campaigns that John Lewis waged successfully, they believe that he made a difference, and he did make a difference.
Jeff, we are watching live from above right now the motorcade, the Willie A. Watkins hearse carrying the body of Congressman John Lewis, followed by a busload of congressional staffers and family members that have been traveling with the congressman from state to state as he's being honored. We understand as we look at this aerial view that they are about a mile away from the 10th Street exit, where they will stop at the 10th and Piedmont Rainbow Crosswalk. Jeff, let's talk about the significance of that moment, because I don't know if people really know the depth of involvement that Congressman Lewis had and why this would be on the list of stops.
Well, he is one of the first to really embrace LGBTQ rights among the old guard of the civil rights. It was kind of a slow go for the most part.
Yeah.
And you can take a look at, you can Google the subject and it will give you certainly a better view than maybe I can give you at this point. But certainly John Lewis was one who in the gay community embraced it immediately. He saw the correlation between LGBTQ rights
and
the civil rights
yeah.
movement of the 1960s, and that everybody deserves a fair shot in America. It doesn't matter your race, it doesn't matter your religion, your ethnic background, or your sexuality, that it's all under one umbrella of fairness and decency and the rights in this country to be able to express your opinion and have your voice.
So interesting, and I didn't know that a lot of people, you think of that location as, sort of like a gathering spot and just like a cool view in Atlanta, and to see that on the list really speaks volumes to the fact that, hey, he had a huge hand in this, to the point where this is one of the locations in the city.
Well, you always saw him in the pride marches,
yeah,
in the parades over the years, and he was always in the community as well. He was, again, that's part of the 5th District, and I've either worked or lived in the 5th District most of my life here in Atlanta, and John Lewis was seen. He was not stealth like so many congressional representatives are, that you don't hear from them, you don't see them, you try to contact them and they issue some sort of statement sent to you via email. You know, John Lewis did that too, but he was in the community, he was seen.
He was going to show up.
And he did show up, and he had time for people when they came up to him about, you know, whether it's neighborhood needs, which, you know, everyone talks about John Lewis in the context of social justice, and rightfully so. But when he was a city councilman, I mean, he was so cognizant and so aware of the different neighborhoods, of the needs of the neighborhoods. You know, we have also talked about he was an opponent of I-475, which was a 6-lane freeway. The government was going to run through Virginia Highland, through Morningside, Ponce Highland, into the old 4th Ward. It would change not only the tax base in this city for all times, but it would change who we are and how Atlanta is perceived above and beyond the city limits. Also, the canopy of trees would have been destroyed as well. You can thank John Lewis for the fact that you can have a lunch in Virginia Highland today in Morningside at Alon's, have a marvelous sandwich sitting outside even in the midst of the pandemic, as opposed to having a Subway turkey Italiano at an exit ramp in your car. I mean, he saved the neighborhood. When the activists needed some strong arming, they needed some support, he was that man, and he was ostracized by many of his colleagues of the Atlanta City Council, and he stood tall. And those neighborhoods, if you love in-town Atlanta, and maybe you're a Republican, maybe you don't adhere to his politics, but he should always hold a special place in your heart, because it's because of John Lewis that your house is worth more than $15,000 in 2020, and these neighborhoods are bustling, and they are an absolute gem of the Atlanta experience.
And that's one of the neighborhoods you told me to explore for historical context when I first moved here, not only for entertainment purposes, but for just how much history is in that area. And as you guys can hear on our coverage, Jeff is our resident history book. Which is
well,
why
I'm older than all of you guys, and I've lived here a lot longer. So that's
what we need.
That's my only role that I play here.
No, it is much bigger than that. It gives us depth and perspective that we would not have in moments like this, when our community needs to know the importance of these moments. We see the crowd gathering there as they cross the Rainbow Crossing at 10th and Piedmont. Pretty sizable crowd there. That's always a pretty bustling area, and members of the LGBTQ community in Midtown in the 10th and Piedmont location. We're going to just stop for a moment here as the hearse pauses there in the middle of the intersection, Jeff.
You know, John Lewis and in town and Midtown, I mean, it puts a lump in your throat. I mean, he defines the area politically and socially, and was always the go-to man when there were issues, and you know, you had a charity event, you needed him at the Boys and Girls Club steak dinner. It was John Lewis who would show up.
That's what I love about it, how many smaller events. We're not talking about big national galas with, you know, $1,000 tickets. We're talking about the Boys and Girls Club steak dinner.
I sat next to him at the Boys and Girls Club steak dinner. It was called the Steak and Burger Dinner, and the adults would get steaks and the kids would get the burgers. No, I take that back. I have that mixed up. It was the adults who got the burgers and the kids got the steaks.
Okay, now you're talking.
That's what made it unique. But John Lewis always showed up at that Atlanta tradition, and he was always there to shake hands with kids and to give a few words. But you know, if you invited him to a charity event, you would see him. And I saw Congressman Lewis here in 11 Alive. I don't know, maybe it was a year ago we had him in here. And he came up to me and he goes, "What was that event you and I hosted back in the 1980s that was a charity auction, and you and I were guest auctioneers?" And I jumped in and said, "Yeah, the one where no one was paying us any mind or any attention."
Right.
And he goes,
like, do you know John Lewis is here?
That was the one. He goes, that was the one where we were trying to speak over the crowd. But it was another example of Congressman Lewis always available at, as you say, these charity events. You know, they didn't have to be the big black tie, you know, mayor mask ball kind of thing, you know, where everybody famous is in attendance. It was at these small, you know, charity events where they needed someone of his name and his recognition to help buoy it.
And that's where you feel
he
the
was always
impact.
there. Yeah.
That's where you really feel the depth of your impact, especially in a time like this.